Janet has been writing for several decades on the environment, nutrition, toxicology, and science policy for Science News magazine. She has a weekly column, Food for Thought, or had a weekly column, Food for Thought. She has a background in physics, and so she covers some physical stuff, but a lot of environmental stuff, and that's how I first came to know her work, is that she covered an environmental science meeting that I attend regularly, and always asked really insightful, good questions at the end of each talk. So I'm like, I need to know who this woman is. She's active in the Society of Environmental Journalists, which she helped found, and she's won awards from a number of organizations, including the National Association of Science Writers and Free Press Association. So please join me in welcoming Janet Roloff. If you are here from JCPS, one of the public school teachers, and you want to get professional development credit, the sign-up sheets are outside, so please be sure and sign up or we can't prove you were here.
Okay. I'm new to glasses, so I can't see you with my glasses. I can't see anything in front of me without them, so unfortunately, and this is a new phenomenon for me, so it's really challenging here, but if I play around with them, that's the reason why. I was brought here and asked to talk about blogs, and it's with a little bit of ambivalence because I am a regular blogger, probably have been for quite a while now, depending on how you define blogging, and I'll try and do that or point out how difficult it is to do that. But the bottom line is, I'm not sure how much I like blogs as a professional journalist, because I really pride myself on trying to put out good quality journalism. And there are blogs out there, as you all know. Anyone can put out anything as a blog. And so the question is, what is the difference between a blog and journalism? And of course, it's sort of mushy. And so I've picked this as my title for the talk, and raised it as a question, and I think the simple answer is that if journalism ever was sufficient, it isn't any longer. And the reason comes from a host of issues that are developing, most of which I ardently wish didn't exist but do. So, back in the early Cretaceous, when I entered science journalism, there were no computers, much less faxes, internet, email, or blogs. The world has undergone a technological revolution since I literally was cutting and pasting pieces of a story together based on drafts that I banged out on a vintage Royal manual. And yes, that is, in fact, a newer model than I used. I grew up embracing the 1970s J-School model of science news, one that relied on deeply reported, objective analyses of emerging developments. But this was an era when people still read books and on paper. So they had an attention span that went well beyond 500 to 700 words. Moreover, with so few news outlets available to most people back then, several dozen professionals could largely shape any particular individual's view of local and global events. No more. People want news and they aren't willing to wait for it. Some are willing to take the unvarnished data. More often, people are asking for on-the-fly analysis of what just happened. Moreover, people want to know why they should care about breaking developments. Such lightning-fast delivery of slightly masticated data and events is where blogs shine. It's also one of their inherent weaknesses, but I think we have to accept that the era has passed when the delivery and analysis of current events is the exclusive purview of card-carrying news professionals. Today, anyone with access to the internet can become a town crier. And increasingly, the masses are listening to these criers with rapt attention, but also, I'd argue, with way too little skepticism. The blogosphere is something of a Wild West. I'm banking on this only being a passing phase. Civilization will come when a once too often burned public eventually demands that sheriffs begin policing liars, cheats, and disembodied voices fomenting unrest. But for now, we need to keep in mind that the digital universe, and especially the blogosphere, is where caveat emptor reigns. Now, you're listening to my take on blogs, so perhaps it helps to understand my bias. I started blogging before I realized that that was quite what I was doing. It was about 15 years ago, and we called what I was doing a weekly column. While focused on food, it actually covered everything from the science and economics of nutrients to environmental issues that affected agriculture, health, and manufacturing. These were not news stories, but pieces triggered by news. They relied on some reporting, but they tended to be the stories that would not find a place in the conventional news hole for our magazine. They had a point of view as much as my managing editor would allow one at the time, and eventually some of the personality that I was trying to inject would bleed through. 4 years ago, things changed. We got a new editor, and he didn't like blogs, but he decided that they were expected. So I was designated the staff blogger, and now I was told to lay off my food coverage and focus on science policy, however I chose to define that. And the frequency was going to be bumped up from weekly to daily, and this was in addition to whatever else I normally did. Although these new blogs were initially edited, our editors soon couldn't manage my extra daily story into their schedules. So I was instructed to begin posting these things unedited, and that the editors would eventually get around to taking a look at them and tweaking them as needed. 3.5 years later, that policy for my blog still stands, and I don't know that my editors ever take a look and tweak anything. As a staffer at Science News, I don't have the liberty, some would say the luxury, of saying anything I want. I can't, for instance, publish anything to which our nonprofit's president or board would object. And I've learned that our readership has a really hard time differentiating blogs from anything else on our internet, website. So there's been tremendous pushback on my voicing strong opinions. They keep saying, you're not supposed to have an opinion, you're supposed to be objective. And we keep trying to say that's a blog, but they go, what's a blog? So, however, having authored hundreds of blogs now, and read at least that many by others, I have a better appreciation for what this format can offer. And I've come to realize it can be a helpful adjunct to conventional science journalism. Not a substitute, but the equivalent of sidebars, updates, and vehicles where we can go off on a tangent. Particularly in this era of smaller news holes, and then when I say news holes, I mean you have less time on broadcast to present a story or fewer column inches to present a story in a print publication. There are plenty of ancillary details that would ordinarily be thrown away, and blogs are one way we can find a vehicle to bring these back to the audience. At least as importantly, in a culture that increasingly wants a glimpse of personality, blogs allow our audience to see a little of the author behind a story. For instance, my life often serves as a source of anecdotes, and I would guess for many bloggers that's true. For my blog on migraines, and this was migraines and how it seemed to not correlate with the risk of cancer, particularly breast cancer, I pointed out in my case, I've had a family history of migraines. My mother, my grandmothers on both sides, my sister, my daughter, we all have migraines. I've come to be known as the migraine queen because I have 75 to 90 of these brain attacks every year, and that's been the case for at least 2 decades. So it was one way for me to, as I'm explaining the importance of migraines, to also say I understand personally that it's a really important issue. People respond back. Some of our readers have been very kind, and they sort of look at that and they have a way to connect with us. And particularly at Science News, and it's an unusual publication in this sense, many of our readers embrace us as part of their family. I mean, they really do take this inordinate interest in us. People will sometimes see me in an elevator with a badge on that says Science News and say, what's Science News? And 2 or 3 other people in an elevator at a science meeting will say, you don't know, and they'll start talking about it, and they'll say, I've been reading it for 25 years. Some people have literally 60 years worth of issues in their basement. Why, I don't know. But they're certainly not going to read it. But they really take a very this proprietary interest in us. So here's one way we can show them a little bit of the people behind those stories they've been reading for a long time. Now, the problem I have with describing blogs, mine or anybody else's, is that they tend to be as different as the people who craft them. In many ways, it's hard to characterize them because essentially they become conversations. And how do you describe conversations about science? Some are well-researched, some are not. They just go off on tangents. They can be on a given topic. They can be on many different topics. They can be on something someone has read or thought about. It's a whole range of things. But what is sort of interesting is even if these blogs are read by many people, very few comment on them. And that's what I think is sort of interesting. We often hear about bloggers having a conversation with their audience, but it seems to me amazingly one way. If you get up to, say, 100, 150 comments from people after having read your blog, you can check on Google Analytics and see that there can be anywhere from 4,000 to 25,000 people who actually looked at it. So clearly, most of the conversations are one way. In our shop, blogs can be an outlet for stories that aren't deemed important enough to win space in the print edition's limited real estate. Or maybe we don't have enough editors' time to process a story. So I may pitch a story and be told, hey, that's really great, but we don't have anyone to deal with it, so blog it. Other times, blogs offer a quick outlet for breaking material that would otherwise be lost. For instance, when I was covering the UN Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen about 18 months ago, I would post multiple stories a day outlining events as they were unfolding. But those stories were unfolding during the hours when our editors were asleep. And meanwhile, they're working while I'm sleeping. So this was one way to get those stories out and just keep them moving. Blogs can also prove a useful outlet for news overflow. I've been covering the toxicology of hormone mimics, also known as endocrine disruptors, since 1993. One of the agents covered in that first story, and literally dozens since then, was bisphenol A. Last year, as news of BPA's presence in paper and its ability to pass through the skin emerged, I ended up writing a dozen stories. This year, I penned another 4, including one just 3 weeks ago. Even as blogs, my BPA stories continue to get mega hits for our website, but there's no way my editors were willing to accept 16 stories over the past 16 months for the magazine. So blogs were a way to keep updating the material that would otherwise go into news. A year ago, Climate Science, which had for many years been part of the Earth Science beat at our publication, was added to my environment coverage when our Earth Sciences reporter retired, and they decided, owing to finances, not to replace him. So I've been following the Arctic ozone depletion in a series of stories this year, beginning in late March. When data last week confirmed 2011 was a record loss, I reported the research team's claim that this finally constituted and made it into the news part of the magazine. Except that there were scientists who really took umbrage with the authors of that article's use of the term ozone hole. So my 500-word story didn't have room to really elaborate on that, and the next day I came out with an 800-word blog trying to explore whether this argument involved more than semantics. Similarly, one of my colleagues covered for me with a September 15 blog on the fact that the National Snow and Ice Data Center had deemed this summer's Arctic sea ice cover the 3rd smallest since records have been kept. A week ago, I followed up with that. It turned out there had been a news report that came out by email around 9 o'clock in the morning saying that a European team had just pulled into port a few hours earlier, and they had what seemed like matched at least the sea ice loss ever reported. So I quickly emailed and asked if I could find someone to talk to. I was lined up and got a chance to interview someone just a few hours off the boat as they came into port. Then I recall that over the weekend I'd seen something on sea ice coverage in one of the major climate journals, so I tracked that down, ended up speaking to the author of that. And in the end, I was able to confirm that what the National Snow and Ice Data Center had reported a couple weeks earlier, and even up to a couple days before this, didn't seem to hold up. So I blogged it. It took me the better part of the day, but I blogged it with a multi-source story. Now you might ask, why blog it? Why not put it in the magazine? It's potentially an important story. But our editors aren't able to handle a story that sort of comes in over the transom over the course of a day. We can cover the no-bells because we know the no-bells are coming. We know exactly when they're going to be coming through and who to interview and save space and save editors' time. This thing just came in the morning. We didn't know if there was a real story there until I started interviewing people. And within 6 hours, I had a story. There was no one to process it. So the standard line is, blog it. From what I can tell, even though I blogged it, it didn't get in the traditional sense in the magazine. I haven't seen anyone else who's covered that yet. So blogs are a way we can sort of move stories pretty quickly, but it's not ideal. Now, everyone knows that the housing industry is sick, and as you've heard a little bit today, my industry is just as ill. But the data on its decline don't make news because most news organizations prohibit the airing of information on their financial dirty linen. According to the Columbia Journalism Review, which tracks trends in our industry, as of 18 months ago, our industry had lost at least 11,000 jobs in the last about 4 to 5 years, mostly at newspapers. And that was before we saw a new round of layoffs a few months ago at Gannett, wherever Jim is, at his company, also at a Boston paper and at the LA Times. Last week, the Denver Post announced that if 15 or more writers and editors, 10% of its staff, didn't accept buyouts, layoffs would be expected. And recently, some publications have just disappeared. The Rocky Mountain News, formerly the oldest newspaper in Colorado, gave up the ghost last year. So did the Post-Intelligencer, the older of Seattle's two dailies. And just the most recent was The Scientist. You may have heard of that. It celebrated its 25th anniversary this month with a special issue. If you go to The Scientist website, there's a special commentary from the guy who founded the publication that says, The Scientist, 25 years alive and kicking, except that 5 days later, management came in from London and said, that's your last issue, we're shutting you down. When these people came in, the publisher said, we have to shut down The Scientist because we cannot find a way to make its journalism pay. In some instances, science and tech reporting have been targeted for a direct hit as news organizations seek to make ends meet. For instance, 2 years ago, the Boston Globe killed its highly regarded 25-year-old Monday Health and Science section. Its staff of 9 science and medical reporters got to keep their jobs. But the stories that used to appear in it have been moved to the lifestyle tabloid or to the business section. And the paper's health and science editor acknowledged that some hard sciences like physics and astronomy were going to have a really hard time finding a place in personal health or business innovation. Bottom line, they may not end up in the newspaper at all. CNN decided it didn't need a dedicated science, tech, and environment team, so 2 years ago it axed a veteran reporter with nearly 17 years experience, along with the 6 producers who worked with him. And even when papers vowed to maintain science and tech specialists, they have resorted to cutting big corners to make financial ends meet. For instance, a friend of Jim's and mine at the Baltimore Sun told me that after amputating about a quarter of the news staff in 2008, the Sun also cut the amount of space devoted to news. So the idea of doing more with less has degenerated, he said, to doing less with less. In practical terms, science and environment stories are now shortened substantially, he said, or even killed at the last minute to meet with tightening space constraints. This reporter observes that although the newspaper still covers the environment and science, it's now with a lone reporter for each after formerly having a team of 6 to 8 reporters. And unlike the old business model where last hired is first fired, the opposite has proven true in most newsrooms. Experienced reporters and editors, including Pulitzer Prize winners, are being jettisoned over their mature salaries and compensation packages. A recent survey by the Pew Research Center's Project for Excellence in Journalism, which other people have mentioned here, has described that the changing culture of the newsroom is leading to a place where new job demands are drawing a generation of young, versatile, tech-savvy, high-energy staff. That's the good news. The newsroom executives also acknowledged that although the release of veteran journalists has been financially expedient, the single greatest loss in the restructuring of newsrooms has been the talent, wisdom, and institutional memory that those jettisoned reporters had held. So it's hard to get a new job if you're currently unemployed. And what has that led to? Reporters who have been laid off, and there have been, as you've seen, thousands and thousands in the last few years, have tried to ply their trade to keep making sure that someone sees them, sees their name, sees what they're doing, and what are they doing? They're doing blogs for free. Perhaps it's in some measure a response to this environment where fewer reporters and increasingly less experienced reporters are covering science, that increasingly researchers have taken to blogging. Many essentially bypass the media to tell stories as they see it. Sometimes they weigh in on others' work, and other times they share their own data, in some instances well before submitting their findings, if ever, to peer review. One notable example last year, oceanographer Samantha Joy essentially posted a daily diary online about her team's findings at sea as they investigated seafloor impacts of the BP oil spill. These posts included images, sometimes video of what they were encountering at the seabed, and they were out at sea for weeks at a time, and you could see daily what they were loading up. This is what we found today. This is what we think it means. Biologist Danielle Lee at the University of Missouri St. Louis launched her Urban Science Adventures blog while a doctoral student as a way to make environmental science, conservation, and biology accessible to inner city people, especially people of color. The posts include pieces on wildlife observations that even a child could undertake in their yard or neighborhood park. And her outreach mission is to make science seem important and relevant through observations and activities outside the classroom. Now, why does she blog it? Because this is not something that journalism or institutional organizations have really seen much reason to invest in. Let's see what we got here. If you haven't checked out We Beasties, look at how these graduate students committed to communicating science to a wider audience home in on a range of subjects. They seem to be focusing primarily on microbiology and immunology this year, and that's probably owing to how many of the posts are coming from Kevin here, who's getting his PhD in immunology. In Ethan Siegel's case, his blog starts with a bang. We have a theoretical astrophysicist who lightens up really heavy physics topics with accessible posts. I particularly liked his recent one that he had on September 23rd on the announcement of neutrinos exceeding the universal speed limit by 60 nanoseconds. And he explained why we shouldn't accept this as evidence Einstein was wrong. What I don't understand is he blogs a lot, and there's lots of art, and I don't know where he finds time for it. I don't think he sleeps. Oxford-trained epidemiologist Ben Goldacre writes one of my favorite blogs, Bad Science. Owing to his statistical background, he often looks at recent journal papers, and he points to flaws in their conclusions when he finds them, and at least as often he will go and look at news accounts of journal articles and say, look, this is how they've described it, except they blew it because that's not what the statistics show. So he serves as his one-man truth squad. But he's also noted recently that he can't blog as much as he wanted to because he does have a full-time job. And then I find Greg Layden's blog a guilty pleasure. He's totally irreverent. He's a Harvard-trained biological anthropologist, as he will tell you again and again and again, as he explains in short, clever, and provocative statements what's wrong with how people are reading science, and he'll also point you to more data than you probably want to deal with. Similarly, there's musings by Forbes.com. Peter Gleick there is the member of the National Academy of Sciences, and in a frequently acerbic tone, he's been covering how people who deny climate change are basically just not reading the resources. The advantages of hearing about the days or weeks events filtered through the eyes of an expert in the field can be just that. These are scientists who can weigh the minutiae of techniques and statistics to assess the significance of news developments, unless they weigh in on fields other than their own, in which case you may be hearing idle speculation, and that may or may not be spot on. The trick is to find sites that you can trust, where the blogger knows more than you do about the material being addressed, and unfortunately you can't judge that by how popular a site is. For instance, in 2008, the public voted with their mouse clicks for the top science blogs in the Web Blog Awards competition, also known as the Bloggies. And the masses named global warming critics the first, third, and fifth place winners. Second place went to an anti-evolution blog. As in 2008, What's Up With That, written by a former meteorologist and weather expert, Anthony Watts, took top prize for science again this year. Still, he's posting regularly, charging that humanity's putative role in global warming is a myth. And all I can say is, ugh. I would recommend people instead bookmark realclimate.org or any of a number of other sites. This is a moderated forum authored by climate scientists, And they have a stated aim to provide a quick response to developing stories that provide context for what's missing in the mainstream commentary. They also will not get involved in politics or in the economic implications of science. They really want to cover science as science. I think that's what we should be looking for more of, but when it comes to what goes into blogs, you have to consider that, again, we're dealing with conversations with an audience, or maybe a continuing conversation. So blogs are, in a sense, I guess, becoming a kind of journalism, but not the best journalism that we can do. A good news piece involves searching for data, events, and ideas that break new ground. The ideas and opinions that are given voice in a news article should reflect interviews with experts, sometimes 2 to 15 in a field. And you're not just saying that this is the facts. I mean, the whole idea of science, as you largely know, is a matter of interpretation. Facts are the point from which you depart. You look at the facts, you sort of mull them over, you see how they fit within the context of other things, and you decide how to interpret them. And if you get 5 people looking to do that, you may end up getting anywhere from 2, 3, or 4, or 5 different interpretations. And that's not crazy, that's just science. But somehow, when you have a blog by one person, be it a reporter, a scientist, or somebody with an axe to grind, you're not getting a variety of opinions, much less a variety of interpretations of real data. As you've probably seen, blogs tend to be the work of an individual, not a team effort. They are written, edited, such as it is, and posted by one person as a rule. They don't see the critical eye and pen of an editor, much less many editors. Some stem from no interviews with primary sources, much less a repeated dialogue with sources to check that any nuances they use are appropriate. And some provide raw data, others are just a platform for a rant or a rumination or humor. Blogs allow cash-strapped news organizations to expand the breadth of the material they cover, but even those by scientists or others tend to represent the views of just the blogger. Journalism, in contrast, seeks to ask questions of many people, then meld those responses. Good journalism doesn't start out knowing what the story will be. Too often, the starting premise of a blog is to give voice to a particular idea, cherry-picking experts and data to support that idea. It makes it interesting and easy to get a consistent idea across. If you start out with that premise, this is what the idea is going to be, then I'll find the information to back it up and put it out. It's nice, it's convenient, it's clean. It often does a disservice to the people who are going to be reading it. What those things are instead, I think, are commentaries, and commentaries do have their place, even in journalism. Yet increasingly, the public has been turning to blogs and conventionally reported news as interchangeable data delivery portals. And I think it's because they don't understand the difference. Unfortunately, by merging and blending the two in their minds, you threaten to inflate the credibility of blogs and deflate the value of well-reported news. So our challenge as science communicators in the next few years, I think, will be to educate our audience on how and why the formats differ, and ways to readily distinguish between them as sources of useful information. It's not easy. If you were asking me how to do it, I'd have to say, at this point, I don't know. I don't know anyone who does. But we've got to deal with the fact that blogs are out there. They are basically unmoderated. There's no police out there to say you got it wrong. It's flawed and full of data, unless you are willing to go out and stick your neck out and serve as the data police on a regular basis. And who of us has time to do that? So while I write blogs and I find them as a useful place to put some of the information I want out there, I realize it's really a double-edged sword. And I invite all of you to sort of weigh in on what the communications, how we can fix this up, because it's going to impact all of us. And it's not just going to impact all of us, it's going to impact, I say all of us in this room, it's going to impact society, because you've got some unvetted information that's being given the same credibility as heavily vetted information and going to be incorporated into policy. We already see that happening with climate, and it just drives me crazy. As you probably know, most of us here think that science should drive, reality, that we should be basing policy on good science, on vetted science, and I just don't see that happening. So I'm hoping you're not disappointed that I'm the person here talking about blogs, but like I said, I have some severe ambivalence here, because it's good and it's bad and everything in between. So.
I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions.
Sure.
Don't you think that this problem is not only found in blogging, but also news, heavily in news where, you know, they talk about things, it's not just in blogs, it's found in, you know, the news media.
Okay, the question is, do I see the same problem being endemic in news reporting generally? News reporting is not perfect. Especially if you have less experienced people out there. They're not going to get the same sources. They're not going to be able to synthesize things as quickly and as carefully. That said, whatever you think of that, as a rule, blogs are even less well vetted. So it's a part of a continuum. Journalism, there are inherent checks and balances. They may not be employed on every story and equally well on every story, but there are inherent checks and balances. There are none, for the most part, in blogs, unless you're working with an organization that goes for edited ones. And then in that case, if it's a public interest group, it's going to be vetted that it carries the policy message they want, and it'll probably be very well written, but it may also be very slanted. And you have to understand that it's carrying the message of a particular organization. If you've got an individual, a scientist or whatever doing that, then all you're getting is whatever that scientist thinks or chooses to talk about. And it's about whatever they've written. And we've learned in journalism, you don't go and just interview the PI on a paper and figure that that's going to give you the message of the story. They said, here, we've just presented the greatest thing since sliced bread. And then you go and talk to a couple of their colleagues, and they said, well, no, we did that 3 or 4 years ago. Or no, you've got some real problems here that they've looked at a very specialized case, but you can't extrapolate it to the whole world. Basically, filtering those ideas through the eyes of others in the field make a big difference. But as soon as you have a story that's one source, written by one individual, you lose that kind of perspective. And that's what I'm arguing we're losing here. Yeah?
So what do you think of models like the one that Scientific American over the last, 3 or 4 months, where Morris has put together all these bloggers who are really already well-respected and trying to, in some sense, formalize that? I mean, is that the way you see this working in the long term?
Like I said, I really don't know how it's going to work in the long run. There are certainly very good people blogging today. There are some really awful people blogging today. There are some evil people blogging today. There are lots of idiots blogging today.
Like that, where you try and basically filter out and find the best bloggers and bring them together through
Yes, if you can give the imprimatur of an organization that you trust, that's a way to help. If these guys blow it, they're going to be dropped. And so you're not going to have that umbrella organization backing them. So yes, that is one way to do it. But remember, how many blogs are we talking about there? There are like thousands and thousands of science-related blogs that are available out there. And people don't tend to go just to a blog site. They go and tap in some topic in Google or whatever, and up pops news stories, up pops blogs, and they're all looked at as being interchangeable. And the question is, are they really? So it's one thing if they see that, maybe they will trust it a little more. But if they're just coming into it by accident, stumbling on it, and it looks in many ways the same way a news story might because of the way it's been laid out, people may trust it in ways that they would trust a news story. And that's, I think, sort of the danger, that we need to have some kind of way to police this, and I don't think we have a great way to do that. This is nice evolution, but we're in the early days yet, and I don't know how it's going to play out. Sure.
Don't you think that part of the responsibility falls on the readership, though? It seems like you're saying that the blog is there to brunt of the responsibility, but shouldn't the readers be able to use critical thinking and to analyze and look at different sources? I think that you're taking too much of the responsibility. What role should the readers play in evaluating these different sources?
I don't think that the problem is with the bloggers. I think the problem is exclusively with the readers. So I absolutely agree with you. But the problem is people don't know how to judge these things. Half of them, even on our site, don't recognize a blog when we tell them it's a blog. They go, well, yeah, so what's that? I mean, they still don't understand. But at least if they find it on our site, they realize it's probably going to be based on the same kind of, in some way, reporting that goes into other stories that they liked enough that they were coming there anyway. But there's no, I mean, the public hasn't been trained to understand what a blog is because it's a conversation. How do they judge a conversation? And it's difficult to vet, you know, the source of this information when it's from a disembodied voice, sometimes with a pseudonym on the internet. And it sounds compelling. And some people write very well and very compellingly. The problem is we just don't know how to vet that. And so admittedly, the public needs to be more critical and involved in critical thinking. But when you look at how many people are tuning into MSNBC or Fox, you know, News for their, you know, political coverage to understand events of the day, neither of those sites is, for the most part, giving them really unbiased news. They're not getting it from a conventional, well, you know, researched site. They're in fact finding commentary, people who are out there to sell a particular point of view that they strongly believe in. And there is a place for that, but it isn't conventional journalism, and I don't think it's what we should be basing our policies on, that is the basic delivery of news. And right now, people are so confused, I think, as this whole media landscape is changing. It's imploding. People are working in different places. You've got good reporters that are out there blogging because they lost their job, and so they're doing a great job. There's other people that just decide that something caught their eye in the newspaper today or on Google News, and they want to just, you know, rant and spout off about that. They all just find almost an equal footing in the blogosphere. And so maybe there needs to be sort of a good housekeeping, you know, seal that's affixed to certain bloggers in certain areas. I don't know how you would do that. But I'm saying it's a very difficult thing, and right now, a lot of misinformation can be confused with good information. And the public is responsible, but I can fully understand why they have a hard time dealing with it.
Okay, thank you very much. So while our next speaker is being hooked up to the technology, let me introduce him. So our next speaker is someone who also blogs. He's our own Jim Bruggers, who works for the Courier-Journal, both as a print journalist and as a blogger. Jim actually has training in journalism, but also in environmental science and forestry, and is a member, former board member, and past president of the Society of Environmental Journalists. Those of you who read the Courier may be aware that Jim is the guy that has been covering issues about Rubbertown and the West End for years and years. I'm sure he'll touch on some of what's happened to his beat as the resources for print journalism has declined. But I think we should all welcome him as another example of someone who's continuing the good fight against all odds. Jim.
Thank you. Well, I am a survivor, or perhaps maybe a relic would be a better word. Maybe it's some of both. I do work for a metropolitan daily newspaper. That was my goal many, many years ago, and I'm still there, despite these epic changes that you've been hearing about. You know, one reason I call myself a survivor as well is the environment beat is not exactly a growth industry in the local news business. As far as I know, I'm the last one standing in Kentucky of a journalist who covers the environment full-time for a daily newspaper. There is one other full-time mainstream environment reporter that I know of, and she works over at WFPL, that I'm glad to have the company. You know, a lot of people have left the business, and there's a whole bunch of new freelancers, and I know journalism professors that are producing this whole new generation of specialized science and environmental journalists who are taking this entrepreneurial approach to their careers, just as Maren has done. You know, the membership numbers of the Society of Environmental Journalists, a group that I helped lead for about 13 years, have actually held strong. So, you know, I'm not quite as pessimistic about the actual number of people that are working in journalism and science and environmental journalism. You know, I do share the concerns about the quality. Newspapers are no longer just newspapers, though. And, you know, the CJ is now Courier Journal Media, and we focus first on the online product. So I may write a story, I may write an update, a brief about something that I'm going to write during the day, and then I'll update it 2 or 3 times during the day, and then I'll have a final version for the paper the next day. That's in addition to, you know, 1 or 2 blog postings that I might do. And you know, this world of science journalism is an ecosystem, and we all have our own niche, and mine is definitely different than if I worked at a magazine or a television or radio station, or if I was a book author or essayist. And I actually have more than one, because there's this traditional role of writing for the newspaper, which is very one-dimensional, but it's as in-depth as I'm able to accomplish. And then there's this kind of updating of stories and following stories between, following issues between the stories that appear in the newspaper that happens on the blog. And that exactly is a conversation. And I found it to be tremendously helpful in my reporting. You heard this term crowdsourcing. People actually out there, you know, migrate. There's a community of people in Louisville that care a lot about the environment and are very interested in it. They work in it. They're passionate about it. And they come to that site and they give me ideas, and sometimes they comment actually on the site, sometimes they just send me an email. Anyway, one of the problems is staffing numbers have declined, obviously. You know, I no longer have people to back me up, so that means, you know, there's breaking news. You can't do in-depth reporting if you're doing everything else at once. And it used to be there were people that would back me up, and I could work weeks at a time sometimes on some stories, and that doesn't happen anymore. But I can still dig into an issue. I just take smaller bites of it at a time. I will say that it's not all grim. This transition has allowed more people than ever to see the work that I do, and all over the world. And we still have, despite the circulation declines, we still have, you know, several 100,000 people, 3, 4, 5, 600,000 people that'll read the Courier Journal depending on what day it is. Okay. Tweeting. I have been tweeting here today. I don't really know quite what to make of tweeting. I'm a little less convinced of its merits, but it does drive readers to the website, and editors count the page views, and that's the future. So that's where the eyeballs are, so that's where I need to be. You know, this industry really is suffering, and we've had layoffs and frozen pensions and salary freezes, and the future is really scary. But you know, I just feel very fortunate to and actually even honored to be the latest in a long line of journalists that have held this environment chair at a news organization that's made covering the environment among its top priorities for at least 60 years. You know, you can look in the CJ archives, and in the 1950s, they were covering Rubbertown air quality issues. In the 60s, the CJ won the 4th of its 10 Pulitzer Prizes for coverage of the impacts of strip mining coal. In the 70s, teams of reporters were discovering toxic dumps that helped lead to the passage of the Superfund Act. In the 80s, they were pioneering the use of computer-assisted reporting to understand how much pollution was being emitted by our industries, and now, you know, we can all go online and get that same information in a matter of minutes if we go to the EPA website. So it was that legacy that drew me here, and in the first couple of years, you know, I spent, and science has always played a very important component of what I do, but it's only a component. I have to mix religion and politics and economics, and all that stuff comes together. It's a very interdisciplinary beat, and environmental health. And you know, the first couple of years here, I spent a lot of time working on stories that dealt with railroad workers and the brain damage that they were diagnosed with after exposure to chlorinated hydrocarbon solvents. And interestingly enough, the epicenter of that was right here on the U of L campus at an old turn of the 20th century L&N maintenance facility where U of L Papa John's Stadium is located now. These stories couldn't have been done without toxicologists, epidemiologists, and medical doctors. A couple of years later, I analyzed data that had been collected by the University of Louisville and the Louisville Metro Air Pollution Control District to bring to light the excessive risks, health risks that people living in Louisville, especially in the West End, by our rubber town industries were facing. And, you know, I can mention U of L toxicologist Harold Hurst and U of L Environmental Institute's Russ Barnett. They were two primary coaches. And I'm always grateful when scientists place their confidence in my reporting, because I recognize that there's often very little in it for them except risk. But there's also a potential payoff. And in 2005, the city adopted a toxic air control program, reduction program, and the levels of some of these chemicals that were coming from some of these plants have dropped precipitously, and our risk now is quite a bit less than it was. More recently, I've focused a lot on water quality and tracking the Metropolitan Sewer District's $850 million consent decree, which is it's a legal requirement that they have from the EPA to reduce the voluminous amounts of sewage that they've been dumping in our creeks, that we've been flushing from our toilets that gets into our creeks. Anyway, the point of this is to say that everything is very different now at 6th and Broadway. We don't have the kind of bench strength and financial resources that we used to have, but what we do still matters, and we can make a difference. Now, one of the things that Professor Perlin asked me to just touch on briefly is, you know, how do I attempt to make these issues I cover understandable and interesting to the public? And remember that I work in this ecosystem of a newspaper, which can be compared to a department store. And at my old newspaper out in California, we had a publisher that at one staff meeting described this as Kmart. And I was thinking, well, you know, he could have chosen Macy's or something. But it is a department store. And, you know, I've got to compete with everything else that's going on in the world. I've got to compete with the exploits of Rick Pitino, the U of L coach, for example. And, you know, that's pretty hard. Sports is a big deal around here, especially when it can get kind of sensational. Anyway, I try to stay, when it comes to science, I try to stay out of the weeds and the minutiae. I simplify as much as I can. The key is finding the essential details that help make a story more powerful and build around that. I need to paraphrase. Often I need to paraphrase what a scientist says, not quote them directly, because frankly, they may be using words that would drive my readers to a dictionary, or worse yet, to the television, to something else. And if I don't ditch everything that resembles jargon, my editors will do that for me. Now, the blog, on the other hand, is a narrowcasting to a group that's already very interested, and I've kind of touched on that already. So I can use shorthand, I can assume they know more, I can use web links to you know, link readers to definitions or complicated terms or background materials. And the other thing is just story selection. I mean, I have to focus on issues now that are closer to home. There was a time not too long ago when the CJ had reporters all over the state. They were wonderful jobs, and the newspaper actually, like many other regional newspapers, was a common conversation, or at least a common reference point for everybody that lived in their state. And that's just not the case anymore. It is what it is, and so I'm focusing very much more closely on Louisville. And I don't know that that's all that bad, frankly. I do think that it's too bad that, you know, there are no more full-time reporters based in Appalachian coal fields, but that's for another, I guess, a whole other talk. One thing that needs to be, I guess, you know, I'm constantly faced with this sense of urgency. My editors will ask me, why is this news now? Why are we telling this story right now? Why, you know, and so that's a question I've got to be able to answer. And then a good example of kind of trying to find scientific data that doesn't overwhelm a story, but actually can help form a story, or be the kind of kernel for a story. There's a U of L professor here, Keith Mountain, who's been compiling, slicing and dicing decades of Weather Service data on Louisville. And when I heard that, I called him up, and he shared with me what he had found, and it was massive. But I just boiled it down to you know, things that really kind of mattered for a story on climate change, and that he and his students had found that snow was coming later in the year here, that it was ending sooner, that winters were milder, that nighttime lows weren't as low, especially in the winter. And, you know, when I combined that with interviews from people who were kind of affected by climate change or whatever, then it helped made a pretty nice little Sunday piece. Also, people. When I worked out, I lived and worked out in Montana. That was where I was when I first started as a reporter, and there I was just very happy to write about grizzly bears and wolves and bison or forests, and I figured, well, they have their own intrinsic value outside of a connection to people, so that should be enough. Well, it may be, but wildlife doesn't buy newspapers or magazines. People do. So editors in California, where there were 32 million people there at the time, helped me understand how I had to, really rethink how I was going to do things. And so, I really need to be telling stories through the lives of people that are most affected by an issue, and helping to really let them know what's at stake. So anyway, I am a survivor and a relic. I have no idea how long my newspaper career is going to last. I work for a publicly traded company, and there's quarterly stock reports and news of layoffs and that sort of thing tends to come after some of these quarterly reports. I do hope that there's a lot of good DNA still in that Courier Journal building when it comes to some of the core issues, watchdog responsibilities, and I hope that that'll be around for a lot longer. So thank you very much for listening.
I think we have time for 2 questions.
Yes.
Might be a little sensitive, but given that your newspaper is owned by a publicly traded corporation, do you get political pressure in how you cover certain politically sensitive topics?
I have only felt that one time in my entire life, and it was not here, it was at a paper in California that was owned by a family, by a man, an individual, and he had a friend who was a cattle rancher, and that's the only time I've ever felt it in my life. There's a pretty darn good firewall that exists. So the answer is no. Anybody else? Yes.
When you said that the stories on Appalachia are no longer going to have the same kind of coverage, knowing that, how do you then somehow find ways to integrate those stories anyway?
Well, the newspaper still covers the basic stories about coal, basically, is what it amounts to. There's one of my colleagues, I believe, did today having to do with coal ash regulation and a vote in the House of Representatives in Washington. We still have a Washington bureau with one reporter, and so that's an example. I track. I'll pick up when there's new rules that are announced, when there's lawsuits that are filed or whatever that prompt, the kind of rise to the level of something being newsworthy. I can still talk to my editors, and they'll send me over to Appalachia. They'll send me to Eastern Kentucky to make a trip, go there and back in a couple of days. It happens, but it doesn't happen like it used to when, the CJ, the Herald Leader, the Associated Press all had reporters based in the hazard area. And so, it's just changed, unfortunately. Yes?
Now, a quick one. Quick, very quick.
It's my sense that air quality here is really bad and very part of it. Do you have any sense of other cities that don't have people reporting? I mean, is there are there control cities around? I'm just saying, is this going to be a tangible effect of having somebody dedicated to environmental issues?
I think that would make a wonderful topic for a communications professor to look into. I really don't know. Pittsburgh has a reporter, and he's done lots of air quality stories there recently. So, Houston used to have one, and I think it worked down, helped improve things down there. I do think it helps, but I don't know.
All right. Thank you very much. If you can help Paul get hooked up, that'd be great. All right, so our next speaker, now I've heard that there's some people who are showing up, not to denigrate any of our illustrious people up to this time, but I've heard there are people that are showing up just now for the, the two last talks of this session. And the person I'm about to introduce, if you were a child in the early 90s, show of hands, anybody? Okay, cool. Or if you were a parent of young children in the early 90s, you may have encountered this gentleman as Beekman of Beekman's World. And he was sort of like the counterpoint. There's Bill Nye the Science Guy, and there's Beekman of Beekman's World. And we were Beekman's World watchers pretty regularly on Saturday mornings. So that's where we got introduced to Paul Zaloom, who is an actor, puppeteer, and conveyor of science to the youth of America. And so he really, did some amazingly fun stuff. Oh, there we go. Already trying to upstage the introduction. And in fact, this is not his first visit to Louisville. He was here about, I want to say 10 to 15 years ago, maybe. I don't know the exact year, but we saw him at Kentucky Center. He had a Kentucky Center, one of his on-the-road shows of Beekman's World. In fact, I have a certificate of having attended this performance, signed by Beekman, and also I guess he was interviewed for Fresh Air, I think, whatever the local Louisville thing is, and that was also a very great experience. And so I'm not going to take any more away from his time, and just say that it's going to be cool.
Thanks, Mike. Those make a real good liner for your bird cage, if you. All right, good. So, hi, I am Paul Zaloom, as Mike said, and I want to welcome you all to my rant today. The title is Science and Entertainment Edutainment, which I hope you find valuable here today. So I am doing a keynote presentation, which is the Mac version of PowerPoint, as you probably know. And as a model for my presentation, I wanted to use this Department of Defense slide, which was on the front page of the New York Times, and it's an organizational chart, and I was very inspired by that. So that's kind of the basis of what I'm going to be doing today. Now, in order for you to understand what I'm going to talk about today, I think the best way for me to kind of get into it is to tell you my life story. So once upon a time, I was born in Brooklyn, in a little town named Brooklyn. Thank you. Please don't applaud. All right. No, that's nice. All right, representing Brooklyn right here. All right, wait in the car, will you? All right, yes, Brooklyn. And here's a picture of me. I love my tractor. I used to ride around. Yeah, I used to ride around in Brooklyn. And take a look at that smile, will you? Right there. You see that smile? And I don't really know how to characterize that smile, but maybe you can come up with something. I want to just jump ahead. I was a fifth Beatle for Halloween one year. Here I am as the fifth Beatle. That's amusing, isn't it? And then I was kind of an average college student right there. And, pretty normal kind of, average kid in college. All right, enough of my life story. I can see you were stunned by it, so let's move on. Why was I invited here today? All right, that's a damn good question. Well, like Mike said, I played Beekman on television's Beekman's World, and here I am. Well, there's the logo, and that's my freakish profile there. And so there I am as Beekman, and I was obviously a little bit younger back in that day. We started in '91. We shot through maybe '98, something like that, 91 episodes, but I'll get to that later. I want to show you a clip in case you're not familiar with Beekman's World. I'm going to show you a clip, and it's only an hour and a half long. So I'm sure you'll, no, it's about 3 minutes, so bear with us if you would, please. A little clip from, it's actually a bunch of characters that I played on the show, because speaking of megalomaniacal lunatic, I didn't want to actually show you an excerpt from the show. I wanted to show off all the different characters I played. So let's have a look at that right now. Here's the excerpt. Fact. In your lifetime, you'll grow about 350 miles of hair on your head. Of course, I can do that before lunch. I'm Beekman, and you've just broken into Beekman's World.
Oh, that's very, very good. Now, taking a nice, relaxing, deep breath, bring your left leg up and wrap it twice around your neck.
Ah, my special theory of relativity. Why is it special? Does it come with raisins? Raisins? Ah, funny! You know, I tried to warn them about atomic energy, but did they listen? No, never mind. Forget it. Goodbye.
Hello, Doctor. Beekman, how are you? Oh, why? What is it? Do I look bad? You look nervous. Nervous? I'm not nervous. I'm terrified.
Hey, did you know this is my first invention? Yeah, that's right. I came up with this in 1609. I was gonna call this thing the faraway make-a-look-a-clososcope, but that's a mouthful, eh? So I call it my telescope, yeah.
Oh, easy, Roseanne, easy. Thank you, my dear.
So I did an experiment.
I purposely gave an 8-year-old boy a case of cowpox. Then later, I infected him with smallpox. And lo and behold, he didn't get sick.
The muscles that close an alligator's jaws are very powerful. But once its jaws are shut, they can very easily be kept closed by a person's bare hand. Care for a candy, miss?
What kind is it?
A Franklin Mint, of course. It's great for your constitution. Hello. You're quite a funny guy, Mr. Franklin. What is this? The Bill of Rights? Hey, who's this guy's founding father? Willard? Hey, how do you like that stamp act? How can you hate the telephone? Well, okay, it made me rich and famous. But now, every time I get into the bathroom, the darn thing rings. Hello. Real glass is made from sand. Fake glass, also known as breakaway glass, is made out of sugar. That's why you can do this. Hey, what are you smiling at? Break up his briquettes into pieces about 1 inch long and approximately 1.5 to 2 inches sideways.
Not your principal, your principal! The Newly's principal!
Oi, 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 oi. I remember. I think I came up with that. Hey, give us noodle for a schmuck little noodle. Our crustacean amazement does not begin and end with melting. No, indeed, because crustaceans have a remarkable ability. It's called self-amputation.
Self-amputation?
Just kidding.
All right, well, thank you. It really doesn't represent teaching science, but it does represent how swell I am. So anyway, 2 questions I always used to be asked by people who met me, and one was, is that your real hair? And I just want to mention, they no longer ask me that question. It's not funny. And then the other one was, are you a scientist? And, you know, a lot of people assumed that I was a scientist, and they were very disappointed. A lot of people were very disappointed to hear me say, no, I'm actually not a scientist. I'm a puppeteer. And I want to just tell you a little joke from Being John Malkovich. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a movie about a puppeteer. And the lead character is a puppeteer, and he's in a bar, and he's trying to make time with this young lady. And she says, what do you do for a living? And he says, I'm a puppeteer. And she says, check, please. So that's kind of what it means to be a puppeteer in our society today. And you know, it's funny, this whole thing, like, are you a scientist, and what that's got to do with being able to communicate on television. Kind of reminds me of Robert Young. Maybe some of you remember him. He was Marcus Welby on that Marcus Welby MD show. And he was on an ad that went something like, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. I don't know if you remember that. There's Marcus Welby right there, and I'm not sure what he's reaching for, but, and actually I found some pretty cool slides of Marcus Welby on the internet. The young George Bush was actually on the show for a while. And there's Marcus Welby admiring Ricardo Montalban's hairy chest, and he's oogling some girl, and aren't these great? Look at that one, huh? Isn't that disgusting? All right. And there he's checking out his stocks right there, and all right. And a lot of emotions in Marcus Welby. Yeah, he's yelling at someone. You paid good money to see this crap, didn't you? All right. And there is, ha, 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 ha. All right, Marcus Welby, enough of that. So do you really need to be a doctor to play one on TV, but scientist? I mean, did Michael C. Hall need to be a mass murderer to play Dexter? I think the answer is no. So I'm a communicator. That's my job. That's what I'm into. That's what I like doing. I do that happily and unapologetically. And it sounds actually, as I hear myself speak, a little defensively. All right, never mind. So yes, I'm a puppeteer, and here's a picture of me with my puppet. That's before the facelift, and there's the one after the facelift right there. So I want to talk now about my, very briefly, about my professional background, and just to give you an idea how I got to this Beekman thing, what I brought to the table. I do adult puppet shows for adults about a lot of different things with 3 different elements, basically, and they are puppets, politics, and humor. And basically using various low-tech, low-brow media, which we kind of translated in Beekman's world, and okay, I'll stop with the transitions. You can't resist with the, the software, it's so idiotic. So basically what I worked with as a puppeteer and continue to work with is hand puppets. Here's a Punch and Judy show. It's a gay Punch and Judy show, Punch and Jimmy, and he's hanging the hangman there. And work with shadow puppets. This is a Katagoz, traditional Arab style of puppetry. I work with found objects, overhead projectors, the toy theater. This is a jumbo toy theater. I also work with miniature toy theater. Ventriloquism, there's me with my dummy, Butch Manley, and we're working together on a couple of projects. Here's me doing ventriloquism in drag, which I'm really good at. Okay, anyway, I've also made puppet films, and the project that I worked on most recently was a puppet film version of Dante's Inferno, where I got to jiggle a lot of puppets around, and in a true case of typecasting, I got to play the devil in that show. So anyway, the subject of the work that I did and I continue to do as a puppeteer included nuclear weapons launch procedures and command and control, which is actually a great subject for comedy. The Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms from the Pentagon, which wrote my material for me, the definition of a nominal weapon in this dictionary is a nuclear weapon with a yield of under 50 kilotons, a nominal weapon. I had a show about the DARE, the anti-drug program DARE. It was about the drug war, also known as the war on black men. I had a show about Guantanamo, the Minutemen, the anti-immigration vigilantes. In the 80s, Saddam is a U.S. client, the Falkland War, the CIA plot to kill Castro with poisonous cigars, indoor pollution. I had a show about food processing. So in other words, I'm sure you're wondering, why am I telling you this? And I guess I'm talking about being a communicator first and foremost, and that I myself find information in and of itself to be entertaining. I happen to be, a nonfiction guy. I love documentaries and stuff like that. I just find nonfiction stuff to be fascinating and information to be fascinating.
And a lot of the times when I'm doing government document exposés or whatever, the government is actually writing my material for me, which is, helps me a lot because I don't have to do it. In order to communicate these things, you really have to understand the issues in a fairly comprehensive way, so you can boil it down to make it simple. And that's what I found out with, like the nuclear weapons launch command and control and the procedures and all of that. I really wanted to understand all of that command and control stuff, how submarine captains, launch nuclear weapons without a direct order from the President of the United States. It's pretty fascinating. And then boil that down into something which, make you laugh your ass off, even though it'll probably eventually kill you. So now I want to talk about how we on Beekman's World communicated to the audience in that TV show, and I'm sure you're looking forward to that. Basically, we did 91 episodes, like I said before. There I am as Beekman. We were on the Learning Channel for the first season and also in syndication. And we were on over 300 television stations in syndication, only maybe 5 or 6 less than Jeopardy, which was the leader in syndication in television. And I'll get to why the show was so popular with the television stations in a bit. But anyway, after the first year, the show was bought by CBS and taken out of syndication, which was a drag because we went from 98% coverage of the United States with the show to about 75 with a loser network, CBS. And the show has played and is currently playing in at least 25 countries, including Korea, and you can go on YouTube and see me speaking in Korean, it's kind of funny. Mexico, Taiwan, Argentina, Canada, Brazil. I'm huge in Brazil, which is odd. And Uruguay, Paraguay, and Uruguay, lots of other countries. So let's see. I've got a slide of one of my cast members. There are 3 of us in the cast, and this is the guy in the rat suit. He wasn't actually a rat. He was a guy in a rat suit. And his name was Mark Ritz, and he was hired to be a puppeteer, actually, because he and I are both puppeteers. We're not actors. And we decided in the course of creating the show that a puppet was a pain in the ass because it couldn't really do anything except you cut to it and it says a wisecrack, and who needs that? Whereas a human could actually handle something and could be more involved. So I remember when he showed up and we told him, no, actually you're going to be a guy in a rat suit and not a puppet. He was set back a little bit, but he was a good sport about it. And then the other, that's Mark there with his wife, Mark Ritz, looking like his usual charming self. And this is the whole cast. We had 3 different young women who played in the show, and this one is Senta Moses. And we really wanted to somehow involve a girl in the show because of the relationship between science education and young women, because the relationship stinks, and we wanted to kind of encourage girls to think about science a little bit more. So we had 3 of them who took that role. So Mark Ritz, I want to turn back to him. Here's a picture of him with his family. He was a lovely guy, incredibly talented. Unfortunately, he died about 2 years ago of cancer. And I was fortunate enough to be with him for the last 6 months of his life. I adored him. He was an amazing human being. We were really good buds. And he was so talented as a performer that it was like having a whip cracking on your ass to make sure I had to keep up to his level. And to do that was, really a challenge. He was just an amazing human being. So I just wanted to give him some props because he so well deserves them, and I miss him like hell. So the next question would be, how the hell did this thing get on the air? And it's a good question because commercial television has no interest in having educational programming. They just don't care about it. They don't make money from it. So our show is actually commissioned and forced into being by the United States Congress with the Children's Television Act in 1991. And that basically said, the act said that you could not get a renewal for your local television station license without having some educational and or social, pro-social, informational aspect
to the programming. So they needed to have a certain number of hours, like 3 hours a week or 2 hours a week, of educational and or informational pro-social programming. So someone got the bright idea of putting Beekman together. By the way, the networks were not happy with this whole ruling, with this new law, the Television Act. So they tried a couple of things. They told the networks that they were teaching kids about the past with a program called the Flintstones, and they were teaching kids about the future with the Jetsons. And then, of course, pro-social behavior was brought forth by the infamous Smurfs. But those didn't work, and so thus our show was born. The show is based on a syndicated column that was syndicated in a number of newspapers, I think 300 or something, across the country. It was written by Jock Church, and it was called You Can with Beekman and Jax. And basically the conceit was that the people would read, the kids would read in the funny papers, you know, in the comic part of the papers, and they would send in questions to Beekman and Jax. Jax was a female character that was with Beekman in the comic strip. And Beekman and Jax would answer those questions. So someone got the bright idea, let's just make a TV show using this conceit, and that will solve the requirements of the Children's Television Act. So we did the same thing on the TV show. We answered mail that came in from the kids. Now, of course, in the beginning, we had to fudge it a little bit because, you know, we weren't on the air, so there was no mail that they sent. So we had some fictional names and some goofy, you know, used our relatives and stuff like that. But the show was created, you might wonder, like, how did a knucklehead like me get plucked out of the void in order to play this part? And they had tried to cast the show in Hollywood and had come up with just like sitcom dads. And as somebody who's produced and also has auditioned, when you're looking for talent in Hollywood as a producer, there's nobody with any talent in the whole town. And if you're looking for a job as an actor, everybody's like a killer actor, and you know, the competition is horrible. And I know it sounds crazy, but it's really true. So anyway, the director of the show had known me from the old days in New York of doing performance art, and so he said, send your reel, and I sent the reel and I did a screen test. And basically, I got the job because I spilled some water in the course of the screen test, and I just ad-libbed because I'm used to doing that, and that sold him on it. You know, the civilians love that stuff when you just roll with the punches and all the rest of it. So I volunteered to help create the show. I didn't get credit for this. I didn't get paid royalties. I actually don't get paid residuals for the show playing or anything like that. But I volunteered because I thought the show maybe would be better if I could plug into it and have input. You know, arrogantly thought that that would be the case. And I didn't have anything else to do, and I really wanted us to end up in the Museum of Broadcasting, which, you know, may or may not happen. But anyway, so I had some influence on the creation of the show in a few different ways, particularly with that low-tech, low-brow, you know, kind of crappy way of doing things. Big inspiration for me in the show was my hero when I was a kid, the kids show host, Soupy Sales. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Soupy Sales, but he was really fantastic. He became very popular with adults. He had puppets on the show too that were really terrible. And then these hands, you see the hands coming in here. There was White Fang and Bluetooth, and here's White Fang, and he would come in. It was just a hand, because Soupy used the television screen as a proscenium, which you don't see in television anymore. You know, it's like the edge of the stage. So something would come in from the edge. It would actually play the edge. And White Fang would do, and then Soupy would translate and whatever. And, you know, invariably, he'd end up with a pie in his face. But we stole that idea for Ray, which was the hand that came in with various props and stuff like that. So that's one way we were kind of inspired by the soup. But also with the kind of two levels of humor for the adults, humor for kids, kind of like Warner Brothers cartoons, with kind of a happy, goofy, hopefully likable lead, which Soup definitely was. He was, you know, he was just such a goofball. And also the whole tone of the thing, sort of irreverent and all the rest of it. The elements of the show, of course, humor, I hope that's clear. Mr. Wizard said at one point in an interview, talking about a couple of science shows that were on the air at the time, including our show, he said, why do they have to be funny? And it's a hard question to answer, I mean, because, you know, why not? But humor is disarming and it's engaging and it allows people to let down their defenses. You know, if people are intimidated or less intimidated, I don't have to tell you, you know what humor does. It's like a solvent against all the craziness in the world, and why the hell not make it funny? It was my attitude. Audience participation, another element in terms of audience writing in with questions. That was a way for people to participate. And also we had experiments on the show where we'd give them a list of ingredients and kids could do experiments at home, hopefully with their parents. The parental involvement was very important in terms of the pedagogical value of the show for the parents to watch. And fortunately, it wasn't too excruciating for the parents to watch it, so they actually did watch with the kids. We had the Dead Guys of Science, which you saw some of the Dead Guys of Science there, Einstein and those guys. We had this really crappy animation on an old Omega machine, which was, you know, I mean, it was just crappy beyond belief, and, you know, like 3 frames, and it was miserable, it was great, and totally inspired by Ed Big Daddy Roth, who was another one of our heroes. Sound effects, over 1,000 sound effects each show. I don't know if you heard them, you know, every time the mouse moved, he would fart, and, you know, it says sugar, I say sugar in the thing, and you hear, you know, it's corny stuff like that, but it was like another layer that was kind of cool to have. The bogoscope, which was something that would come in a screen, and then we'd super stuff on it, and I love that, the bogoscope. Art cards, little paintings, instead of having computer graphics or whatever, the set designer would paint little paintings, and I'd just whip them into frame and have a little painting and be for a factoid or whatever, which is a cool kind of low-tech way of doing stuff. We had 2 penguin puppets, Don and Herb, who were named after Mr. Wizard, and they were part of the shtick. And really, our thing was trying to turn liabilities into assets. So, for example, if you needed a duck to fly through the frame, instead of getting a green screen, all this other crap, we would just get a rubber duck and hot glue it to a stick and pull the thing through the frame. We had to make sure the stick was big enough so everyone saw the stick, because it wasn't going to be magic. It was going to be, you know, bogus and ridiculous and cheap and crummy. And that, you know, turned out to be a liability, I guess. And then the way the show was shot was very, very idiosyncratic. 2 cameras touching each other, ultra-wide-angle lenses, never boomed, never zoomed, never moved. Cameramen come in the beginning of the day, they'd set up the shot, they'd walk away. And what made the show kinetic were the actors moving back and forth between the 2 cameras. That's how they made the cuts, by us moving. Very, very idiosyncratic way of doing things. How are we doing on time? Good?
Yeah, maybe
Okay.
another 5 minutes.
Okay, good. So, from topic vaccinations to the center of gravity, we covered centripetal force, Bernoulli's principle, the theory of relativity in 6 minutes, which is, you know, an interesting challenge. I have a live show that I do called Beekman on the Brain, which I hope I'll find time to talk about really quickly, where I talk about neuroscience for 6 to 10-year-olds, which is also an interesting challenge. But our specialty on Beekman's World were really things like snot and saliva, body odor, dandruff, hiccups, burps, barf, and finally, last but not least, farts, which finally the network let us do farts because we'd been chomping at the bit to do farts for a long time, and they finally said, okay, you can do it. And these are pathways to get to kids through, you know, it's experiential, and sort of like porno for kids. We were pandering to them and whatever, but they just love the bodily function stuff. And instead, you know, so now they can look at the world when they, you know, they're picking their nose, that stuff that comes out is not just like a between meal snack, but it's actually, you know, the sticky stuff that traps dirt and germs and all the rest of it. So, you know, they're looking at the world in a different way, which is what science is, it seems to me. The process, we would pick a subject, and, you know, from the questions, we'd have a table read on Mondays and come up with ideas. We would rehearse the other half of Monday, and we would shoot the rest of the week. So we do about a show and a half a week. It's film style, stop and go. It wasn't sitcom. So we worked at a very, very fast pace. It was a lot of pressure and a hell of a lot of fun. Now with my live show, I'm just going to run through these real quick. I use illustrations, for example, to show how the nervous system works. I use an example, okay, we talked about the process, of me being at a party and drinking a glass of milk. Now this is one of my shitty drawings, and I use a whole bunch of these, and I'm at the party drinking milk, and one of my nephews, I have these two nephews who are identical twins, except one has a gold tooth and the other one doesn't. One of them's very wicked and the other one's nice. So the bad one picks up a pie and he throws it towards my face, and there it goes, approaching my face right there. And then I talk about what happens in a very tiny little bit of a second in the brain, which is basically the light bouncing off the pie and going into my eyes, and the occipital lobe creating a picture of the pie, and then the temporal lobe, identifying it, and et cetera, et cetera. And finally, the message being sent back down to the knees, and the message, of course, is to bend, and that's what I would do. And I explain that all happens in a very short period of time. And then, of course, as I duck, well, that's the wrong duck, but anyway, I duck, and here you see the pie flying past me and about to hit my nephew Alphonse in the face. And I say that my cerebellum helps me keep my balance as I get up, and I spin around in time to see the pie hit Alphonse in the face, and it makes me laugh so hard that the aforementioned chocolate milk comes flying out of my nose, like so. And I ask the kids if they'd like to see a close-up, and of course they say yes, and there's the close-up right there. So that's one of the ways, I found myself to communicate how the brain works in response to a situation. And so, I have a great job. So finally, obviously we can't be science teachers. We're not trying to replace science teachers. We're really trying to just hit the treetops, so to speak. And we want to make science accessible and non-threatening so that, yes, you too can get it. Anyone can get it. That's the idea. And we want to open the doors to science, which in the past people have, felt like they've been locked and they haven't been allowed in. So, for example, a neighbor of mine who's an artist, he watched the show because he said, I knew that if it was pitched towards kids that I was going to get it. So that's why 52% of the audience for this kids show was in fact adults. A majority of the audience was adults. Now we see ourselves as a small part of a team in terms of science education. A team of teachers, parents, libraries, science museums, bloggers, magazines, newspapers, other television shows, etc. And here's that team right here pictured that, oh, that's the wrong team. There we go. So there's some of the people in the team. Just can't stop with the jokes, can I? So is it entertainment or is it education? I would say that it is both, and it's unapologetically both. Do teachers have to be entertainers? Interesting question. My inclination is yes, because my best teachers were passionate, they were excited and exciting, they were funny, they were charismatic, caring, sensitive, focused, and very serious. And they were good at keeping our attention in the class. So yeah, why the hell not? What's wrong with being a performer? I'm getting defensive again. Okay, so finally, does the show work? Okay, well, we only reached a certain number of kids. It was not an overwhelming popular success. It was a critical success. Spielberg said it was the best kids show on TV, blah, blah, blah. But really, the success was the Power Rangers. They were blowing us out of the water, and that's kind of a cool old school slide of the Power Rangers. It's cool. So the only evidence I have of whether the show worked or not is really anecdotal. And I'll tell you that this evidence at times can really move me and make me very emotional. Indeed, okay, that's inappropriate, but it really does move me. For example, when a parent will say, my kid made paper on her own from watching your show, from the recipe and the whole thing, kid actually made paper. Or my kid really got excited because about science because of you. And I hear this all the time, these public appearances and all the rest of it. I actually, here's a kid right there. I got a note today from Rich, where I'm staying over at the Columbine, that he had posted about the fact that I was staying there and presenting today, and a friend of his wrote this note about this person's developmentally disabled son, and what the person said was, Mr. Zaloom was a terrific influence on my son during a very valuable time of his learning to communicate. He can do many of Beekman's experiments from rote memory. It used to amaze his early teachers because, unlike other times, he was excellent at organizing his thoughts and communicating. Just like Beekman with a passion for science, tell him thank you. So I have to say, finally, folks, I have a lot of people telling me I am a scientist today because of you. And I had somebody say to me once, you must get sick of hearing that, and I'm just here to tell you today, I never, ever get sick of hearing I'm a scientist today because of you. Thank you. Thanks.
We literally have time for 2 questions, but remember, there's going to be a reception after our last speaker, so definitely come up and talk to I was going to say Dr. Zaloom. Dr. Zaloom.
Dr. Lazoom, that's me. If anyone got aches and pains, I can help you with that later. So are there, yes?
Do you think that there are any TV shows that have kind of taken up where you left off and fill that niche for science education for young children?
The question was whether I've seen any TV shows that have filled that niche, and I hate to say it, but I don't watch television because it just pisses me off that I'm not working, so I turn it off and I go to work. I mean, I know it sounds idiotic, but I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know. Any other questions? Insults? Comments? Yes?
The fact that Bill Nye was on at about the same time, there's some clear similarities.
Yeah.
Did you two talk at all? Was there any interaction?
Who's Bill Nye? No. Well, Bill, he in the press said, you know, that he was a real scientist, and I was an actor, and then he changed it to performance artist. But we already sort of covered that territory. I never felt in competition with that show because the more the merrier, and there were some similarities, the sound effects thing, you know, and we were on the air before that show. But anyway, you know, I think the more the merrier. And how about one more question?
Sure, one more.
If there's one final question. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, do you think that Kramer picked up on your move?
You know, it was a question about Kramer. I did a television convention because we were both working for Sony, which owned Columbia Pictures Television. And I had this moment when I ran into him, you know, and we were being escorted by our various handlers from one, you know, thing to another. And we both sort of looked at each other. And another time, this has nothing to do with Kramer, but I was at some event at the Greek Theater or somewhere, and I was performing as Beekman, and I passed Little Richard. And Little Richard looked at me, and I looked at him, and you know, I could have just died right in that moment, right there. So that didn't answer your question, but it was fun answering it. So thanks a lot.
Let's see, we're going to install Carl with your...
In one venue or another. He's a frequent contributor to Discover magazine and perhaps best known these days for his work in the New York Times. He also teaches classes at Yale on science writing and various other types of writing. Has authored a number of best-selling books, including things like Parasite Rex, and he has recently delved into the world of ebooks with his book Brain Cuttings. Also is author of a non-majors evolution textbook, The Tangled Bank, which is a very nice piece of work. And I think soon he has coming out a book called Science Inc., which is INK, which is all about science and tattoos. And we're just delighted to have Carl here to talk to us about, his title's not up there, but something to do with science communication. Thank you.
It's, newspapers, blogs, and other vectors.
So I see it on the computer. So that's good. And all right, so great. Well, thank you guys for coming and for sticking in there to the bitter end. And it's a little daunting to talk after so many fascinating presentations. And in a way, you're going to look at a couple of the slides and say, wait a minute, we talked about this already. So I will move swiftly through those. I think basically what I'm going to do is do what our previous speakers have done, is just tell you about my own experience. And we have different experiences going through this transition. And part of it has to do with where we were before this transition began. We're coming from different directions. I might be maybe a bit more optimistic than some of the previous speakers, although I hope not unduly so. But basically, what I just want to talk to you about today is about experiments. Science is about experimenting, and science writing can be about experimenting as well, particularly now as opposed to when I started. I started way back when. I have a laser pointer, and I'm going to point this to you. This is called a mailing label. So once upon a time, there would be magazines actually printed on paper, and they would be put in the mail, and they would put this there so they would actually get to you, and someone would bring it to you. Discover is where I began a long time ago now, about 20 years ago, and for me it was a fantastic education. Really. I was hired a couple years out of college. I'd been an English major. I was always interested in science, but I didn't take anywhere near the amount of science I should have because all the classes were at 8 a.m. in the morning, and I had my priorities, quote unquote. But anyway, I got a job as a copy editor. I was a terrible copy editor, but they let me change to fact-checking, which was fantastic, which is basically it's up to you to figure out what's right and what's wrong in someone else's story. And you could basically learn how a science story was put together and see where the mistakes came up, how really great writers put things together. And so where I was coming from was the world of magazines, places where you would regularly read articles were 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 words long. So for me, when I was thinking about who was influencing me and when I was looking at models for what I wanted to do, I might look at people, say, like John McPhee, for people who were doing journalism, but they were also trying to create beautiful writing. It wasn't deadline writing, which is incredibly valuable. It wasn't newspaper writing. It was something else. I would look at, say, the essays of Stephen Jay Gould, which appeared in a magazine, in Natural History, for every month for a number of years. That's what I was coming from. You would have basically be expected to write about all sorts of things starting out at a magazine. After doing fact-checking, they started letting me do some short pieces, and the short pieces got to be longer and so on. Eventually, what really came to captivate me, I guess you could call it natural history, just sort of the biological world, ourselves included, and how strange it could be. So, dolphins, for example. I mean, everybody knows about dolphins, but when you look under the hood, it's a totally bizarre mess. Why is this thing that looks like a fish, why does it have lungs? Why does it have to come up to the surface all the time to breathe through its nose, which is on top of its head? It's crazy. It doesn't make sense. But, if you look at the evolution of whales, then things start to make sense. And so after a while, as I was writing, more and more articles, I really started to become fascinated with evolution as a way of talking about all these different things without, flying off in too many different directions. So Charles Darwin, for example, wrote about whales. So and at Discover, I would write about this question that came up in the origin of species. So Darwin would say, okay, this theory of evolution, I know it sounds crazy, but here's why I think it's true. And if I'm right, then whales are the way, and dolphins are the way they are because they were land mammals once. So Darwin had this idea, he had read somewhere that bears would sometimes swim around with their mouth open and insects would fly in. And he said, okay, so maybe that's how whales evolved. And he was roundly mocked for this idea. I think he must have been really embarrassed because he actually took the suggestion out of later editions of The Origin of Species. So you have to look at the early editions to find this suggestion. But the whole idea of whales, having come from land, was a long-term puzzle because paleontologists really couldn't tell you. They couldn't show you fossils that would shed any light on it. And creationists would love this. For example, there was some creationist I think in the 80s made a video where he was, would try to drag a cow to a river or something like that. And it would just be like, yeah, how could this possibly happen? Of course, science actually gives you answers. And while I was at Discover, paleontologists started to find these fossils. So this is called Ambulocetus, and it's a whale with legs. That's what its name means. It was Hans Tevesen, who was in the Northeast Ohio Medical School, found it in Pakistan. And this is its complete skeleton, nearly complete skeleton, about 45 million years old. And so it was a fantastic experience for me to be able to write about these really epical moments in the history of biology, and to be able to dedicate some space to it in a magazine, and to be able to get great illustration to go with it. So I worked at Discover for about 10 years. The last 4 years of it, I was a senior editor. But I got kind of restless. And so, you've heard, so I took a kind of a different path than other people you've heard about today. It was 1999, I left my staff job because there were a lot of things that I wanted to do, and I wanted to be writing for other magazines as well as Discover. I still write for Discover regularly. But I wanted to write for places like National Geographic. National Geographic is a different kind of magazine than Discover. It's a bigger magazine for one thing, and when you write stories for them, it's very strange because they'll say to you, okay, so let's work out where you're going to travel, and we're really concerned that we, economize. So what we want you to do is we want you to organize your trip so that you go all the way around the world. Because the round the world tickets are really cheap compared to going to all the different places. So you say, okay. So National Geographic is the kind of place that will send you to really, really cool places in pursuit of a story. And to their credit, they will still do that. But I'm still motivated by some of those things that I first became passionate about, learning how to write about science at Discover. And this is an article from this February about feathers. How did feathers evolve? Dinosaurs had feathers long before they could fly. So how did you get from dinosaurs walking around with feathers on them, maybe showing them off to attract their mates, to something that could go in the air? And this is one very cool experiment from University of Montana, Ken Dial has done, showing that juvenile birds will, when they run up or run down very steep surfaces, will actually flap their wings, not to fly, but to help them move up and move down these surfaces. So this could be one part. This is one idea about sort of an intermediate again, very similar to what I was writing about in terms of whales. I don't know, these intermediates just completely fascinate me. I've also started to write for other places, and that has been, it's been fascinating to adapt to these different cultures. So about, I guess about 4 or 5 years into working as a freelancer, I approached the New York Times and just said, you know, I would really like to, I have some ideas I'd like to write for you guys. And they said, okay, why don't you send us some things, we've seen your other work. And so as Lee mentioned, I mean, I write there a lot now. I mean, they try to keep me busy. And, you know, fortunately, the Times is still dedicated to science. So the Science Times is still, you know, got a big staff, and they take a lot of freelance work from people like myself. And what I really like is that they're not obsessed with the quote-unquote news you can use. You know, here's, you know, this is why you should drink green tea because of some flaky health study that isn't really very good anyway. But, you know, then we can have a tea ad next to it. Well, that's great, huh? They're actually still interested in basic science, including natural history. So this is just an article on the evolution of venom. Like, where did venomous snakes come from? It turns out that the venom actually evolved before the snake. You know, writing for the Times is different. So each different place has its different culture, its different format, and so, you know, you know, your biggest story in the New York Times might be 1,500, 2,000 words long. That's a big story for them. So you've got to economize a lot more. And, you know, when something happens, there'll be times where they'll call me up and say, can you get this to us tomorrow maybe? So you got to be able to hustle and at the same time get the story straight. So the challenges are different. But, you know, one thing that I like is actually that, you know, magazines about science are often subscribed to by people who are, you know, God bless them, just love science. Whereas someone might come across a story in the newspaper, you know, they didn't subscribe to the New York Times just for the science, but they come across it and they read it, and there'll be someone I would have reached that I wouldn't have otherwise. And that's an important thing. Kind of what touching on what Marion was saying is like, you know, you don't just, as a writer, you don't want to have some narrow group that you're reaching. You want to reach as many people as you possibly can. And so, you know, for me, when I'm looking at these different opportunities, that's something that really interests me. So, as many journalists do, I found myself getting a little frustrated in the sense that, you know, the story I did on the evolution of whales, it was a pretty relatively short piece, but, you know, the folder I had of material was like this. Because the more I researched it, the more fascinated I got about how actually, you know, this question of where whales came from, it didn't just come up last week. Nothing in science is new. You know, the questions are old. Some of the answers might be new, but the questions are old. And so Darwin was asking that question. You know, people were arguing about whales long before Darwin. You know, is it a fish or is it not? I mean, if you read Moby Dick, Ishmael says, all right, look, I know some people are suggesting whales might be mammals, but damn it, it's a fish. And so this was, when you get into the history, it's incredibly satisfying, but at the same time very frustrating because newspapers and magazines, they just don't have that much room just because of the physical constraints, at least when you're talking about physical constraints on paper. So at the time, what you might do is write a book. So my first book was called At the Water's Edge, and it came out of a couple articles that I had written for Discover. One was about the evolution of whales. The other one was about vertebrates coming on land. Because at the very same time that people were finding intermediates, whales with legs, they were finding intermediates 360 million years ago when these vertebrates were first coming on land. And you would basically find fish with fingers. And this was happening at the same time. And so I thought, well, there's this beautiful symmetry here, and I can really explore that in a book and get into the history. And so, so since then, I've written lots of books, including my second one was called Parasite Rex. Basically, like every kid, I was fascinated with parasites and and tapeworms and such. And then I discovered there was this huge, fascinating body of research about it. And when you're looking around for a book idea, there's no more satisfying feeling than when you're starting to do some research, you just feel the bottom fall out because you just realize there's so much there. And every time you look into another aspect of it, it's even more interesting than what you were reading about before. Books, the thing about that makes for effective books is when you can tap into people's curiosity. So people kind of know about parasites. It kind of freaks them out a little. But they might be willing to find out more about it. And then if you can take that opportunity and then jump into the stories of the scientists who discovered all sorts of things about how, in fact, parasites are the most successful life forms on Earth, then you're going to be able to pull them all the way through a book. But what was really interesting to me as I would work on these books, like the parasite books, for example, was that there were these people working in other formats who wanted to talk to me and wanted to sort of recraft what I was doing. Now, so I would be on the radio a lot, and I was some really weird things, like, I don't know if you ever heard the show Coast to Coast. It's sort of the crazy all-night conspiracy radio show. I sort of figured, well, whoever will have me, I'll just deliver the science, and I don't have to say that UFOs put mind-controlling tapeworms on Earth. I can just talk about mind-controlling tapeworms, because it's true. Which kind of blew their mind even more than all their crazy alien abduction theories. But what was really satisfying also was that a producer for This American Life called me up, like a couple years after the book had come out, Parasite Rex, and she said, you gave me nightmares for a long time. And I said, you're welcome. And so I think that we should have you on the show because we're doing this theme. The theme of this show we're going to do is called Enemy Camp. And so This American Life does, several different stories on a theme. And so she just thought, well, finally I can do something about these nightmares. I can have you on the show. And it was so fascinating to me to kind of explore a different way of presenting this stuff. This was just something I didn't know anything about, but I was in really good hands. The producer, Starling Kine, and Ira Glass, they got on, it got into their studio in Chicago, and I was in a studio in Connecticut, and we just talked. We talked for like an hour and a half. And we just go on and on and on and on. And, afterwards I thought, I didn't do a very good job. I'd been up way too late the night before, and I thought I was just not being very focused and all. But, they were able to take, the best parts of our conversation and craft that into a story. And it was, I learned a lot by just listening to what Ira Glass, the questions he was asking, because he obviously had a sort of set list of questions, but he would go in directions where he thought there was something live, there was something unexpected, he would pursue it. And so he had that spontaneity that, that sometimes in journalism we don't have so much. So, my favorite example of this was where I was, he was just talking about how disgusting parasites are, and I just said, well, wait a minute. And I launched into this very long defense slash praise of all the adaptations of parasites, and there was a long pause, and he said, Mr. Zimmer, whose side are you on? And you know, and it was such a great way of like kind of getting at the heart of what we were talking about. And so you know, I felt like in that experience I was learning a lot. And since then, there's a show called Radio Lab that's started up with Robert Coleridge and Jad Abumrad, and they Jad actually just won the MacArthur Genius Grant because they have it's just a sort of sui generis kind of way of approaching science. They don't even call their radio show a science show. They just ask big questions, you know, like what is randomness or things like that. And then they find these wild different examples to work with it. But they are so again, it's been fascinating to work with these people in these other kind of formats. And because they're in New York, I actually have gone and, you know, worked with them. I've been on a couple of their shows. And you go into a windowless room and, you know, you put on some earphones and there's a sheet of glass, and then the two of them are on the other side, I guess because they don't want their guests to lunge at them and attack them or something. I don't know why, but there you are, and they just kind of talk with you and work, you know, just try to get to the bottom of things. And and it's very deceptive the way that they do radio. Because if you listen to their shows, it sounds totally off the cuff and kind of goofy and just sort of a bit loosey-goosey. But that is just part of the presentation. They are actually real sticklers underneath. I mean, you listen to the way the sounds, like Paul was talking about, listen to the sounds that people put in TV and radio. Things can be beautifully put together. And you may not be aware of how well put together it is until you concentrate. And the example that I found of just how good they are is that we were, again, this was their episode on randomness, and I had been talking to them about the fact that, you know, our cells are not like little regular machines that go click, 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 and just, you know, churn out proteins at a regular rate or so on. They're not clocks. They're just very wild and bursty and semi-random, you know. So, you know, and that's what's really baffling is that you have this very kind of noisy production of different proteins, and yet these proteins interact with each other in this incredibly complex network to do these incredibly sophisticated things. You know, how can that be? I mean, how can you have this sort of randomness at the core and then this beautiful adaptation coming out of it? And so Jad, we talked about this during one of our meetings, and then Jad went off and did this beautiful recording of where he was sort of looking at one protein network that acts kind of like a noise filter. And you know, he came up with this metaphor. Metaphors are so important in presenting science, and his metaphor was he had this, there was some woman who had a recording of her grandmother singing, and I think they were on wax cylinders. And so Jad, you know, used a noise filter to pull out her original song. And it was a lovely piece. And he played it for me in the studio when I was back in this windowless room. So he plays it for me, and I'm getting nervous. I'm thinking it's so beautiful, but that's just wrong. So he finished it, and I said, it's wrong. That's the wrong metaphor, because you don't understand. There's no original precise song at the beginning of this process. It actually emerges out of this noisy process. And he was like, what? and Robert Coleridge was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, it's wrong. And they would not let me leave that windowless locked room for like 2 hours while they tried to understand why I was wrong. And then they actually like worked in that conversation into the episode, where I'm just come in being the killjoy, and you know, but they worked through it. They worked through the process. And so again, they could just see an opportunity to do something that, you know, you haven't seen before. Another very unexpected, surprising experience of writing books is that they inspire other people. And so I discovered later on that there are several horror and science fiction movie people who like read my books and then turn some of these species into, monsters or plot devices or so on. And these are just a couple examples. So, books, these old-fashioned books are very much a part of my life, and I enjoyed very much. Again, it's sort of the kind of the old, it's part of the old tradition of writing about science. And some of the issues that Bruce is talking about, you write articles and then maybe you start to write books that come out of them, or sometimes you write books that just come out on their own. But it really is I didn't realize it at the time that I was starting out in this, but that I was sort of at the very end of a certain age of journalism. This is such a beautiful photograph, but it's a rarer and rarer sight. Every town used to have a place like this, but not anymore. Now you might see that. You've already heard some of the horror stories. I'll just throw you a couple more graphs up. Graphs that I think every journalism professor should be required to show the first day of their class, because their students need to know what they're facing. So newspaper circulation has crashed. I started right about there. I had no idea that. Who knew that was going to be where things were going to go? I didn't know what I was getting into. I was a kid, the same basic kind of graph. The issues that Janet talked about so eloquently. When newspapers shut down, when newspapers trim back, one of the first victims is the science section. So we've lost tons of science sections. This goes up to 2005. I've been trying to get Christine Russell to give me more recent numbers. I don't think she's tallied them up yet. I'm sure it's much lower than that. Okay, well, again, where I am now and what I do now, in large part, sort of came out sort of by accident through experimentation. This crash that was happening, and I don't think any of us really realized what was going on, was happening at the same time, and I think fairly independently of another phenomenon, which was the internet. So when I was at Discover, the internet in the 90s was so far from the minds of newspaper and magazines people that those of us who wanted to experiment really had to work hard to convince our superiors that it was something worth looking into. So I literally one day had a conversation with my boss. I said, there's this thing called email, and we should get it. To which my boss replied, what's wrong with the phone? And so, just the very process of trying to get email was a struggle. And, and you could kind of see why, because at the time, just to date myself, to use email, you had something called a modem with little red lights, went beep, and they were going about 1,000th the speed of what you can do with a computer like this. So you didn't exactly look at this thing and say the future. I talked to a scientist one day I was doing an article on colliding black holes, and he was like, well, if you could just go on the web, I have a visualization of this on my website. And I said, your what? Because I had no clue about the web. And so he, God bless him, just took me through the process of getting this very early browser that the University of Illinois had set up, and there I was. I was looking at a simulation. I was looking at pictures of his kids. I was like, what is going on my computer? Why is it on my computer? This seems wrong. But then I said to my editor, okay, thank you for the email. Now, there's this thing called a website, and we should get one. And I don't know what he said. What's wrong with the phone? I don't know. But basically I said, okay, look, so what we need to do is we need to register a domain. And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, just do it. Discover.com, okay? And again, who would have guessed that Discover.com might be something worth millions of dollars in the future? It was all, you couldn't take it seriously at the time. For some of us journalists, it was something just fun to explore. And when I went freelance, I thought, well, I set up a website, and it wasn't because I thought this is the future of the internet. It was because I was getting sick and tired of photocopying my clips to send to editors to introduce myself and ask for work. So I just put up a website and put my clips there, and then I would use this thing called email to email my editors and say, if you want to see things that I've done, here's a link. But this thing took on a life of its own, as we all know. A few years after setting up my website, I started noticing that some scientists and some journalists were writing things that called weblogs or blogs, and I was fascinated by it because you could do whatever you wanted. And I actually think that there's a whole lot of good in that, in a creative way. There are definitely big problems with, the fact that anybody can put anything on the web, but I think that's just an aspect of the free press. And I'm coming from, you got to bear in mind, I'm coming from a background of writing about evolution, so I know about all sorts of misinformation long before there was an internet. Pamphlets, books, videos, and so on put out by creationists. So this is nothing new to me, and so I guess I tend to sort of focus on some of the more positive elements. So for example, while I was freelancing, Stephen Jay Gould had stopped doing his essays, and not too long before he passed away. And then I was actually asked, along with Jared Diamond, to sort of alternate writing about evolution each month. And this was like a huge honor. And I got to write an essay, which I really hadn't been doing much as a journalist at the Times or at Discover. And I loved it. And I just sort of felt like I was learning this wonderful genre that had been, great writers like Gould had really perfected. And then they decided they weren't going to do that anymore. Because they were redesigning the magazine, and they just thought, essays, who wants essays? And I looked around, and I was like, there's really nowhere else I can do this now. Nobody wants essays, but I want them. I want to keep doing it, and that's around the time that I discovered blogs, and it was just software. Blogging is software, and so now I essentially had my own printing press, and so I could write about what I wanted to. And so that's what I did. So I've been doing it now for 8 years. I'm actually, Discover has sort of brought me back in the fold, and actually pays me to blog, which is weird. But I still, when they took me on, I was like, look, you cannot expect me to write X amount of words, a week, X number of posts a day, or something like that. That'll kill it. And anyone who is required in their job to blog, I feel you have my condolences, because there's nothing more awful than sort of blogging at gunpoint, and you can smell the unhappiness coming off the screen. It's a terrible thing, and all sorts of bad bosses think it's a great idea. It's not. So there are lots of things that I like to do with blogging. Here's an example of a blog that I wrote about just a wonderful parasite I discovered, a wasp that basically performs brain surgery on cockroaches so that it can lay its eggs inside them, and then you see a new wasp popping out of that cockroach's body after all is said and done. There are all sorts of different things that a blog can be. In a way, because it's open-ended. So as I said before, it can be a home for essays. So this is an essay I wrote about how snake venom, the subject I'm fascinated by, sort of the history of snake venom as something being studied, and how it actually ended up becoming incredibly important for the drug industry. When I was at Discover, I would write sometimes about biomechanics, and this is again when I was being sort of insane and asking for modems and things. And I would say, wouldn't it be amazing if you had this picture, you're writing an article, let's say about bat flight, I don't know, and instead of just a photograph of a bat, which doesn't tell you that much, you could just press press the picture and it would be a movie. Wouldn't that be amazing? And they would say, yeah, whatever. And we, it turns out that actually bats also, vampire bats, when they're on the ground, they gallop. And this is video that is just part of, scientists' everyday stuff. And now, we have the tools to actually use this stuff in blogs. So, I went to I went to talk to a scientist at Brown, and I said, who studies bat flight and bat locomotion of all kinds. And they were just sort of showing me these videos just to sort of make a point. And I was like, could you email that to me? Because, with just a few clicks of an embed code, I can just drop that in and have an essay with moving pictures. And it's easy. It's very easy to do. And things that, in my own career, would just, things that would make my boss tell me just to be quiet and get back to work, I can do now. The strength of blogs, and really, increasingly the strength of web-based journalism, is that you can go viral. There are ways to get the word out beyond these sort of traditional barriers. But you have to just make sure that you're making what you write, make it easy for it to go viral. So ways of embedding things. This is a talk I gave. I gave a lecture about the ecology of the microbes in your body. I just put my iPhone in front of myself. I recorded it. I was able to upload it to an audio hosting site for free, embedded it in there, and then anyone else could embed it if they wanted to. And I put my slides up as well. So that a talk that, that otherwise would have only gone to like 100 people who were in the room, ended up, thousands of people ended up, getting either listening to it or looking at the slides or learning about it in one way or another. And when they were interested in it, they could tell their friends, and things can radiate outwards. My favorite example of this is with that parasite wasp I was showing you. It ended up being, a lot of traffic came to that from a video game forum. Ton of traffic. Because these video gamers were like, this wasp would be an awesome character in this video game that they were talking about, and some of them were designing. So you are getting the word out about entomology to more people that way, and not in any way that you could have really expected. Another shortcoming not shortcoming, but limitation, shall we say, with traditional journalism is that you write your big story and then you're done. And as Janet said, you can follow up on things. So I wrote a big story in the New York Times about a big debate that E.O. Wilson was having with other evolutionary biologists about, why, for example, ants will help each other. And the story went on, and I couldn't have gotten another story into the Times about it because they have a limited space. On the blog, I can just follow up on it and just continue to follow the things that interest me. And I think that my readers get follow me because they know who I am and what interests me, because I follow my obsessions. And also, again, as Janet said, I'm going to be saying that a lot during my talk, as Janet said, these are conversations, and I will focus on the good side of the conversations, which is that it really fundamentally changes the way that we as journalists work. So we're not just up there and we are delivering the authoritative view of things, but there are many voices. Anyone can have a blog, anyone can leave a comment. What I like to do is to try to sort of nurture the conversation in a productive way, and I'll give you an example. So this is a post I wrote. I'm sorry that the links are hard to see, but so this was earlier this year. So there was a paper that came out in a journal, had a very provocative suggestion that basically there shouldn't be any whales. And the reason being that every cell in your body, in any animal's body, has a small chance of becoming cancerous. And whales are so much bigger than other animals that if you do the math, blue whales would all be dead by the time they're like 40 or 50 or something like that. But obviously whales live well beyond that. So there's something going on. So whales have evolved some kind of anti-cancer protections that we need to learn about, as difficult as that might be. So it was a really, it was a very interesting, provocative idea that these people at the University of California at San Francisco were putting out. And the comment thread just sort of went on and on. Like people were like, whoa, wait a minute, what about this, what about that, what about, and I, tried to answer some of them, but, I thought, well, maybe I should bring in the scientists themselves, because they might be able to deal with this in a much more effective way than I. And so I actually did get in touch with them, and they jumped into the comment thread, and I think they answered 30 or 40 different questions in great detail about it. And so this was it was a conversation that went way beyond what I could have done in a regular article. We now have, basically anybody can get their hands on professional recording audio equipment. So I've been fooling around with podcasts and video. It's tricky stuff. It's more work than it might seem, so it's one of these experiments that I'm probably not going to be pursuing too much. But again, the very fact that I was able to do it at all is pretty mind-blowing. And as Lee mentioned, there's now, now we have this possibility of ebooks. And ebooks are really fascinating to me for a lot of different reasons. One is that a bunch of people are reading them. So, writers want to be going to where the readers are. Increasingly, that's ebooks. There's a sort of a revolution going on with ebooks right now akin to blogging. In other words, you don't need a big publisher. You do not need a big printing press to publish. You can write something, you can upload it to Amazon's Kindle site. It will be for sale in a matter of hours. Now, if a million people do that, there's probably, each person may, probably should not expect to be getting rich off of it. But at the very least, it opens up lots of new possibilities to explore. So, my modest exploration has been, I write a column about the brain for Discover Now. I've been doing it for about 3 years. And I've been putting together some of them into collections. The first one was called Brain Cuttings that came out last year, and I'll be putting together another one in about a month. This is stuff that I think that people would enjoy just reading in this different kind of format. People might save their old magazines, but how often are they actually going to read them? This is another format to experiment with. However, I do not want to appear like someone who says that this is all going to be sunshine and happiness. I too share a lot of concerns, and maybe nothing sums it up more for me than the way science is depicted on the Huffington Post. So here's how, when swine flu broke out, this is what you would get in the Huffington Post. I'll just read a little bit of this to you. It's from Marion Williamson, who's a New Age person. It's totally bizarre. Okay, so in italics it says, "Dear God, please take away the swine flu. Amen." And then in regular type, according to Martin Luther King Jr., there is a power in us more powerful than the power of bullets. King knew that that power was the power of the Spirit, capital S. Call it a religious power, or spiritual power, the power of consciousnesses, or whatever. It has to do with the power of the mind joined with the power of the divine creator. So don't be fooled when it comes to this conversation about the swine flu. This flu wasn't created on the level of the body, because no disease is. It was created on the level of the mind. And it is there that we were rooted out at the causal level. So this is published in a place that gets 40 million views every month. All right? And this is Arianna Huffington here shown testifying in front of the Senate about the future of journalism. So I have shivers going down my spine as well. But I do want to talk about ways to deal with this. We can complain, and I think it's valuable to complain, but in fact, I think that that these new kinds of media actually offer us opportunities to deal with these very same problems. And I have been trying to experiment with that. And so I'll give you one sort of case study that happened in August. This is Baroness Susan Greenfield. She's a neuroscientist at the University of Oxford. She was the director of the Royal Institution, very prominent in England, is on TV a lot of the time, and gets interviewed a lot. And whatever she says gets quoted. And so here's something from the Daily Mail, a newspaper, I'd point out, a very well-established newspaper. So I think we need to sort of think about the fact that quote-unquote traditional newspapers are not always perfect. And in this case, very far from perfect, because here's a typical kind of article that you'll see. Social websites harm children's brains, chilling warning to parents from top neuroscientists. She says these things regularly. She's been saying them for years with zero evidence to back them up. So just recently, she decided to take it up a notch by bringing autism into this. So people would say, well, how do you know that actually all this new media is rotting our brains? And I mean, I'd love to have actually a real conversation with someone like Marianne about this. This is not a real conversation. This is not science. She says there's an increase in people with autistic spectrum disorders. Oh, okay. So the very fact that we have this increase in autism spectrum disorders is evidence of this problem with social media. One of the Baroness's colleagues at Oxford had something of a small seizure when she read that. And what did she do? She actually took to her own blog, a blog that she did not ask anyone's permission to start, but a blog where she could express herself in a venue that did not exist 10 years ago. There would have been no way for her to really respond effectively 10 years ago. Now there is, and so she's got her own blog. This was an open letter she wrote to Greenfield, and this is just a little part of it. You may not realize just how much illogical garbage and ill-formed speculation parents of children with these conditions are exposed to. Over the years, they've been told that their children's problems are caused by their cold style of interaction, inoculations, dental amalgams, I hadn't heard that one, faulty diets, allergies, drinking, and pregnancy. The list is endless. Now we can add to this list internet use. Click. Except that here, at least, parents will be able to detect the flaw in the logic. A cause has to precede its effect. This test of causality fails in two regards. First, demographically, the rise in autism diagnoses occurred well before internet use became widespread. Second, in individuals, autism is typically evident by 2 years of age, long before children become avid users of Twitter or Facebook. So you'd think that this would cause the Baroness to temper her remarks and might, cause journalists to not just always print whatever she says as, as link bait. But no. Asked to defend this by The Guardian, she said, she then said, well, I'm not actually saying that it causes autism. She says, quote, I point to the increase in autism and I point to internet use. That's all. Totally irresponsible way to deal with a very traditional media. Again, just wanted to point that out. So I think that's when I had a seizure. I just couldn't deal with it anymore. And it was just so simple and such an obvious thing. And I felt like I could sum it up in a very short little statement. Maybe something was, maybe 140 characters long. Because that's all you'd really need to just show the problem with it. So that brings us to Twitter, which is actually something that Greenfield claims is rotting anyone's mind with a Twitter account. And again, don't get the sense that I think that's all groovy. I don't let my kids are 7 and 10. They do not have Facebook accounts, and they're not going to be getting them for a long time. Nevertheless, this kind of stuff is just totally over the line. So I just, by coincidence, happened to be working on something, and I was reading about how rates of esophageal cancer started to increase in the 1970s. And some people are suggesting that might be due to the increased use of antibiotics. because it flushes out the good bacteria along with the bad, and that you could then have a sort of an imbalance that would lead some bacteria that are associated with cancer to, sort of colonize your esophagus. So I thought, well, that's all well and good, but gee, couldn't there be some other explanation for the rise of esophageal cancer in the 70s? Geez, what other thing can I talk about? And I thought, what about television? What about watching television? So I said, just basically taking her construct, I said I point to the increase in esophageal cancer and I point to the Brady Bunch. That's all. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the conventions of Twitter, that's something called a hashtag, which basically is a way that you can people can kind of collectively make a conversation searchable and followable. So there's a hashtag for this meeting right now. I just decided to create a term, a Greenfieldism, because I felt like, there's something so maddening about, throwing out correlation and suggesting this causation, and irresponsible, I felt like. So Twitter is something totally mysterious to me. I got put on sort of a suggested users list for science, and so whether I tweet or not, I get 200 new followers every day, which obviously shows that the quality of my tweeting has no reflection of the number of people following me. Whatever, I'll take it. So it's like 80,000 or something now. So I send that out, and then, so let's see, the timestamp of that is 1811 on August 6th. So at 1816, someone says, someone reads it and says, I point to Alzheimer's and I point to cheese doodles, that's all. This was sort of a way for us to kind of get our kind of collective frustration out and to make an overall point. I point to climate change and I point to a dramatic decrease in seafaring pirates, that is all. If anyone, I don't mind if you take out your smartphones or your laptops. If you want to go to Wikipedia and look for global warming and seafaring pirates, you actually find a graph showing a correlation. I'm not kidding. No, this is before this. I point to the increased rate in paper cuts. I point to the increase in 3D movies. That is all. I point to vaccines. I point to the explosion of skinny jeans. That's all. Somebody who knows how to keep track of these things told me a few days later that there were 1,300 of these Greenfieldisms that popped up. And the Guardian ended up writing about it. It just says it was a way, it wasn't, I sort of expressed how I felt, but there were a lot of other people who felt the same way, and together we kind of pointed out that this is really ridiculous. Now, Greenfield is still doing this. So like today, she gave some talk, or I'm sorry, yesterday, I was just reading this. She gave some talk where she said that actually, that the internet can actually cause dementia. Dementia was her term. So she is still doing her thing, and I don't think anyone will ever stop that. But at least, there's a way of dealing with that kind of stuff, a new way of dealing with it, which is, I think, worth exploring. So finally, I just want to get to this thing that some people alluded to before as kind of the ultimate case of this unexpected experience that you can get through some of these new kinds of media. And I'll just tell you this little story. So I'm friends with a neurobiologist at Harvard named Bob Data. I know him from way back. He went to college with my brother. My brother's son was at a birthday party, turning 4, I guess, and so there was like a pool party. Everyone jumped in the pool, so Bob's in the pool with his boys, and I noticed that he's got a DNA tattoo on his shoulder. And I've known this guy for a long time. I'm like, well, I didn't think you were kind of a tattoo guy, Mr. Harvard neurobiologist. And he said, yeah, well, guess what? It spells my wife's initials in genetic code. And he went into the whole color coding system. He had come up with it, because he had to get the codons and get it on, because it's actually the amino acids that spell EEE. Oh, I thought, well, that's lovely. That's a perfect expression of geek love. But in the back of my mind, I was thinking, wait a minute. I was just in Chicago, and there was this postdoc I was talking to who studies development, in evolution of development. He studies paddlefish, because paddlefish come from this really primitive line. And he had a big old paddlefish on his arm. Beautiful thing. And I thought, I wonder if like, you know, I've been talking to these scientists for years, and I wonder if some of these people have these tattoos they've been hiding from me. I want to, like, you know, find out. How can I find out? So I said, Bob, just hold still, click, took a picture. You let me put it on my blog. And I just said, anybody else out there, scientists, have their science tattoos? You know, within minutes, I started getting emails, started getting pictures. I don't know, I must have gotten like 50 in the first week or something. And I was like, just sort of putting them on my blog, just like, well, hey, look at this, look at, and after a while, I just couldn't keep up. But it's been, this actually, it was a really sort of fascinating experience for me, because all branches of science have tattoos. I mean, there's not a branch of science you can give me that someone hasn't sent a tattoo. I mean, linguistics and neuroscience and anthropology and astronomy and physics and so on. And some are pretty simple, and some are not so simple. But a lot of them have stories behind them, really interesting stories. So, for example, there's a neuroscientist who has a neuron on her foot, which is the kind of neuron that's attacked in Lou Gehrig's disease. That's what causes you to die, is you lose these kinds of neurons. Her father, when she was 18, died of Lou Gehrig's disease, and that's when she decided to become a neuroscientist. So this is not just something you do when you get drunk and, you know, you just want to, like, go crazy. This is actually an expression of a deep passion that this scientist has. This is the kind of thing that gives you a sense of why scientists, like, spend crazy hours doing their science. It's a very hard line of work. I don't need to tell the scientists among you just how challenging it can be. And this, to my surprise, gave me a wonderful glimpse into this sort of state of mind of scientists. And I'm friends with some book designers, and last year they said, you know, we should do a book. I mean, you've got hundreds of these things, so why don't we just crowdsource this? And you know, so I sent out an email to everybody who had sent in tattoos, and I put it on my blog, just said, look, send me a really good picture, you know, high resolution, and then from that we organized a book, and then I actually ended up writing like very, almost like little essays about all sorts of things in the history of science, things I didn't even know about, you know, how one of the most important equations in the history of quantum physics was discovered when one physicist was cheating on his wife in the Alps with his mistress, or how LSD was discovered and now has become actually a tool for understanding how the brain works. All sorts of fascinating stories that I wouldn't have known about if I hadn't done this experiment. And so this is what's come of it, is an actual book, I mean a real book. I'm talking, this is actually, I should have brought with me, but this is a die cut. This is actually the inside, you know, the inside page. This is a die-cut, gold-stamped, hardback book. You're not going to find this on Kindle. Kindle can't handle this. This is a book. This is as old kind of technology as you can get. And so, what has surprised me, the biggest surprise, you know, that I've had recently, is the way that all this media has brought me back to an incredibly old-fashioned way of talking about science. So who knows where the surprises will stop. So thank you very much, and I don't know if you have time for questions, but I'd be happy to talk. Yes?
You talked earlier about newspapers and that access to a reading public that wouldn't otherwise be seeking out science information.
Mm-hmm.
But also that you have to keep it very short. Are you, or how would you like to see it, I suppose, online extensions of those newspapers? Is that allowing a larger amount of information than the print medium would? Would it be tapered to prevent overload for people?
Okay, so the question is, what does the online side of newspapers allow for kind of expanding on the constraints that traditional newspapers impose on your writing? And that's a really good question, and I actually was thinking about getting to it, but then there was just too much to talk about. So, you know, the articles themselves still have to be able to fit on that piece of paper, that old sheet of wood pulp, you know. That's still the big constraint. So, you know, and we, you know, when I'm writing a piece, my editor and I will talk about what it will look like on the printed page. So I wrote this piece about slime molds. That was my most recent contribution. Another underappreciated form of life. They're everywhere. They run the world, and they're incredibly important, and they're weirdly intelligent. Blah blah blah. Okay, so it turned out that some slime mold, you know, a guy who actually wrote a guide to a guide to the world's slime molds. You can actually buy a copy of that if you want. Just has these amazing photographs of all sorts of species of slime mold, because there are far more species than people realize. And so we said, all right, this is how, you know, this is going to look good because we have color printers, and so we're going to get some of the most gorgeous, iridescent, freaky slime molds, and we're going to put them on the cover of the Science Times. And so that's what we did. But the story was, again, 1,800, 2,000 words, which is very long for them, but, you know, couldn't go any longer. So lots of things I couldn't talk about. And, but online, there were lots of other things that could be added to that. So, for example, they created a slideshow from the pictures in the newspaper, plus a whole bunch of others that there wasn't room for in the newspaper. The Science Times has a podcast, and so they asked me to just, you know, be on their podcast to talk about the article. There's someone who is able to sort of do these weird oscillations that go back and forth inside a slime mold as it's sucking nutrients from all over the place. These things can get to be, you know, yards long, and they can move. It's scary. So someone had figured out how to turn these oscillations, these waves inside these slime molds, into music. And so we played slime mold music, you know, just because we could. So there are lots of things that you can add to that. But it's not like I wrote a 10,000 word piece about slime molds there. But if I felt like it, I could take that article and make it the basis for a 10,000 word ebook, because there's the format there that didn't exist before. So, so certainly places like the New York Times are going very, you know, they're putting in a lot of investment into the online side. You know, it still isn't, you know, places like the Times are still facing really hard challenges, and, you know, there are going to be more layoffs at the Times, for example. But, you know, I'm glad that they're still willing to think creatively, as opposed to just responding to this challenge by saying, well, if we cut 90% of our staff, then, you know, we won't have to pay all those salaries, and everything will be great. Because that's a totally losing strategy, I think.
Other questions?
Anything else?
All right. Well,
thank you very much,
Carl Zimmer and all of our speakers. So you've done it. You've done it. You've sat through a 6-hour infomercial on science and communication and why we want to communicate science. And there's more. There's a reception out there in the lobby. But that's not all. At 7:30 on the dot, we are going to adjourn to Strickler Hall, which is very close by. There's signs to get you there. And there will be a moderated panel discussion with all the folks that you've seen so far.